real talk about the Bible. When I named this series that, I knew that it was going to be challenging, because if we were going to have real talk about the Bible, it was going to bring up some hard subjects, because the Bible isn't an easy book. But frankly, this episode in specific, it's a little intimidating to me. Because in this episode, we're going to talk about some of the weird stories in the Bible. Because if we're going to have real talk about the Bible, we can't ignore the fact that within this book, there are some troubling, strange stories. And if we as Christians are going to call the Bible our holy book, if we're going to consider it the book that guides our lives, if we're going to call it a book unlike any other book, well, then we have to come up with some explanation or some reason for these stories being in there, because the fact is, they're there. Whether it's the story of Jephthah coming back from battle and saying, I'll sacrifice the first living thing that comes out of my home, and it's his daughter, or the time that they cut up a concubine into 12 parts and sent it out to the 12 tribes, or the time that Lot's daughters got him drunk so that he would impregnate them, or the time that God flooded the whole earth. I mean, can we talk about the flood story for a second? That is not a children's story. Why do we make that a children's story? It's a story about everyone dying. It's not a pleasant story. Or what about the time that a bunch of children died for calling a prophet Baldy and they were mauled by bears? The fact is, we could go on for quite some time just listing out the numerous strange and concerning stories that we find, especially in the Old Testament. And so again, what are we supposed to do with these? And how are we supposed to handle these stories? And I think the first most important thing when addressing these stories is the same thing that I've been addressing all throughout this series, is that when we read the Bible and we're struggling with part of it, it's important that we ask ourselves the question, well, what is the Bible? Because so often we have this concept that the Bible is a book of rules, it's a book of do's and don'ts, it's a handbook for life, it's general guidelines on how to live a good life. But that's simply not what it is. In fact, I would challenge you to reshape that paradigm and think of the Bible as an overarching story, the redemptive narrative of mankind in which God is redeeming humankind and the world, that leads ultimately to the climactic moment of Jesus' death on the cross in our place for all of us, to bring us back to himself, to redeem us and redeem the world. And that the whole Bible, it's this one giant narrative leading to that moment and then propelling us out into living out as redeemed people. And so I think an important thing is understanding where you're at within that narrative when you're coming across these stories. Because so often we come across these stories in the Old Testament, and when we want to understand things in the Old Testament or things in the Bible in general, it's important that we understand the paradigm of progressive revelation. And progressive revelation is an idea that God has been progressively revealing himself throughout time. That at the beginning of time, we only had a fragmented view of God, that we only had part of the picture until he was revealed in full in the person of Jesus, that Jesus is the fullest, most complete picture that we have of God. When we see God in human form, and when he walked with us and talked with us and taught and eventually even died for us on a cross, and while we killed him, he said, Father, forgive them. That is our most complete picture of God. So when we read the Old Testament, we want to read it through the lens that the same God we're reading about there is the same God that hung on that cross for us, that the clearest picture of God we have is in Jesus. And so we have to read through the Old Testament through that lens. And that at times people didn't understand all of God. They didn't have a Bible yet. They hadn't seen God in Jesus. And they were a lot of times just doing their best to understand something that is so hard to understand, and that being, well, God. And so I'm not saying that in the Old Testament that what we see there isn't true or isn't accurate or it's not as inspired, but you have to understand that when we're reading about these people that are going through their lives, they only had a fragmented view of God. They didn't have the whole picture yet. And another really important thing when reading biblical narrative and reading stories in the Bible is understanding the distinction between what is described and what is prescribed. The distinction between description and prescription is so important. And what that essentially means is that not everything that is described in the Bible, not every story that is told is being prescribed to us. And that not everything that we see the characters in the Bible doing are things that we should be doing. In fact, most of the time when we're reading the Old Testament, we're reading more about what not to do. In fact, when you read through the Old Testament, something you find very quickly is an absence of any real hero. You see, the thing is, oftentimes when we're reading the Old Testament, we can learn just as much about mankind, if not more, than we do about God. It's as much anthropology as it is theology, because we're reading about just the fallen and broken nature of man, because that sets us up for the redemptive story of God, in which God redeems people and his creation. And in order to get to that redemption, in order to understand why we need Jesus, well, we have to see that we need redeemed. We have to see the brokenness of mankind. And time after time in the Old Testament, we see even the people that we think are going to be heroes are these flawed creatures just like us. And in fact, the biblical narrative, it starts with the story of Adam and Eve, and they're set up perfectly in the garden, and then they fall, and then they give into the temptation of the serpent. But then it tells us that later there will come a man who will crush this serpent, who won't give in to that same temptation. And all throughout the Old Testament, we're waiting, well, maybe this character is it. And then they have this flaw, and oh, no, they're not the one that can overcome the temptations of this world. Maybe this one, no. Maybe this one, no. Even David, who's described as a man after God's own heart, has serious flaws. He has an affair with another man's wife, and then he has that man killed. Clearly, he's not the one that can overcome that temptation. But eventually in the story, we go all the way throughout the Old Testament, never finding this hero. And then in the New Testament, we're introduced to Jesus, who is not only man, but was in fact God, who is the one who could go through life, live a sinless life, and then die on our behalf so that we could be redeemed, so that we could go back to the way things were always meant to be. And so when we come across these strange stories, understand that oftentimes these are just showing us how messed up and broken we are, and are not reflections of God, but are rather reflections of us. Lastly, one thing that's always important when reading the Bible, whether it's a struggling piece of narrative or one that you think you understand easily, is understanding the historical and cultural context as well as the literary context. The historical cultural context is understanding the time in which this was written and the time in which it's describing, which also aren't always the same thing. Sometimes it's written in one period describing a period that was longer ago. But it's important to understand that because God, well, he let us participate in writing the Bible. The Bible was written by real people who lived at real times and real places, and their time and place in history affected how they saw the world and how they interacted with the world. And also, the stories we read about, they take place in real times and real places under certain cultural situations. And we can't expect to import our 21st century understanding of cultural and norms and values and whatnot onto the ancient Near East when these stories took place. Reading the Bible is an inherently cross-cultural experience where we are traveling across time and across cultures into new land, into different territory that we can't expect to be just like what we are familiar with. Tim Mackey, the guy behind the Bible Project, uses this metaphor that I think is really helpful, and he says it would be like traveling to some third world country and getting mad that they didn't have the same malls and fast food restaurants that we have. You know inherently that you can't do that because you're in a different culture. But imagine even more so traveling in time to a place far different than your own and expecting them to have fast Wi-Fi and 4G. You just don't do that. And so it's the same thing when you're reading the Bible. You have to understand that there is a cultural and time gap between you and the time these stories took place and the times they were written. And so you have to enter into that culture, enter into their mindset to better understand these stories. And sometimes that alone can help explain these things that seem weird to us, were in fact not that weird back then. And then the other part of context is literary context. The Bible isn't just a video camera view of what happened. Anytime something is written, it is using literary techniques. It is arranging it within a story. And most of these narratives, they are sub-narratives within narratives in the book, within narratives in that section of Scripture, within the whole narrative arc of Scripture itself and the redemptive story of God. And so when you read these stories, you have to understand what their literary function is too. Why are they placed here? Why is this story being told to us? The biblical authors don't have to tell us anything, so why did they tell us this story and place it here? What impact does this have on the other stories around it? What impact does this have on the story of this book as a whole and the story of humankind that is told throughout the Bible? Oftentimes when we see stories in their literary context, we can get a better appreciation of what the author is getting at here and why he thought this story was important for us to understand given the other stories that are around it. Okay guys, thank you so much for watching this. If you've gotten to this point in the video, first of all, congratulations, because this video, it was a little more nerdy than some of my other videos. I can see it's already gone longer than I wanted it to go, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it gives you a little more confidence when approaching some of these really troubling, difficult stories. And just another piece of advice for you is when you come across these stories, realize that you don't always have to have the answer. Reading the Bible, it's a lifelong journey, and at times you just won't understand, and that's okay. We talked about this a lot more in the first video in this series, but I always just want to reiterate that it is not on you to have the right answer to every question that ever was regarding the Bible. But I do hope that this video provides you with some ways to be a little more confident when approaching these stories and just read them with more confidence and be able to understand why they're there and what we're supposed to do with them. If you've enjoyed this video, I hope you click like, I hope you click subscribe, comment, let me know what you thought. If you'd like for me to maybe break down some of these difficult stories in individual videos, I'd be happy to do that if that's something you're interested in. But until next time, guys, be sure to watch some of the other videos in this channel and stay tuned for what's coming next. See ya.